new diplomacy? That's the big question of the day. I'd like to share with you very, very briefly my own definition. When I joined the Foreign Service, in the Israeli Foreign Service, you have to go through a cadet program. It's a 2-year program. I never had a dream to become a diplomat. In fact, my dream was to become like my friend Brett Burns and Jack Baxter here, and later on Michelle Ohayon will be here. I wanted to be a documentarian, but I ended up becoming a diplomat. Towards the end of my cadet course, I was told by Human Resources Department that there's a new executive that was just appointed to a very, very important job in the Foreign Service, and he would like to meet with me, some sort of a job interview. I said, okay. I walked into his room. He was on the phone. He completely ignored me for about 30 minutes, I'm not kidding. While he was on the phone, apparently he was on the phone with the foreign minister at the time. His name was Shimon Peres. And after he was on the phone, and he started talked and talked for another 30 minutes about his vision for what Israel has to do with Gaza and what Israel has to do with this and with this. And then he asked me, so what's the story with you? Are you, I said, well, I just said basically 2 words, I'm available. And then he said, okay. I left the room. I get a phone call from the head of human resources telling me, well, what's your magic? I said, what are you talking about? He said, this guy fell in love with you. He says you're the most brilliant diplomat he ever met. I said, I didn't say a word. I just listened to him the whole time, which is really, in essence, diplomacy. The ability to listen, the ability to understand, not to be transactional. Don't approach people only when you need them. Build relationships exactly when you don't need them. Because when you need them, they'll be there for you. It's all about relationships. It's all about the ability to absorb and to learn and to be curious about the other. Someone told me, you don't win a relationship, you build a relationship. And this is one of the biggest lessons of diplomacy. So, about new diplomacy, let me just set the record. When you Google new diplomacy today, this is what you will see. You will see definitions that speak about the non-centrality of government, how non-governmental organizations are now becoming more and more important. And this has been the case since the beginning since the wake of the Cold War, really. And that was the classic definition of new diplomacy. I would like to offer to you a much more inclusive definition of what is new diplomacy. But first, let's look at the traditional tasks of diplomacy. So the diplomat was expected to be a communicator, to collect intelligence, to represent his or her nation, to be able to conduct negotiations, to provide services like consular services, and to manage crisis. These are the classic assignments of diplomacy. And when we spoke about diplomacy, we had 2 different definitions of diplomacy. One was very high-level policy making, right? Like Kissinger. When we think of a diplomat, we think of Kissinger. But let me tell you the truth. Even Kissinger was never Kissinger. In other words, there is no such diplomacy. This is called policy making. The reason we call it diplomacy is because we don't understand what diplomacy is really all about. Diplomacy is a profession. It's not an occupation. It's a practice. People have to be trained to become diplomats. Just by the fact that you deal with diplomatic materials doesn't make you a diplomat. It means that you're dealing with policy issues. The second definition is something that more relates to popular culture. When we say to people, "Oh, you are so diplomatic," we're trying to tell them 2 things. First of all, you're very polite. And secondly, you're probably not telling me the truth. What is diplomacy? The classic definition. The art of letting someone have it your way. Or telling someone to go to hell in such a way that they ask you, when is the next bus leaving? These are all famous definitions of traditional diplomacy in popular culture. But the point is that the information revolution really changed everything for us. Look at what the information revolution did. It created an information overload, an unprecedented access to volume, ability to self-design. Our reaction as human beings is anxiety, tribalism. We're trying to look for simple solutions to highly complex problems. Look at Brexit. Look at the Mexican border issue. The building a wall is a beautifully simple solution to a highly complex problem that needs to be studied. Old traditional diplomacy is inadequate. We know that, and we have plenty of evidence. What's required, and this is my definition, is a quick shift from a model of advocacy to a model of marketing. From government to people, right? Let me give you 3 examples. If diplomacy in the past was all about the external world, today we know that diplomats have to bring into consideration also domestic audiences. Why? Because the internet is eliminating the importance of national boundaries. If you're a diplomat in New York and you posted something in English on your website, someone in Australia can be affected by it as well. So territory is no longer that important. The second thing, traditional diplomacy was largely programmed and designed to deal with nations and governments. Today, the most important unit, social, economic, and cultural unit in our lives is the city. And we know that 75% of world population will live in urban centers within 30 years from now. New diplomacy has to bring into account the importance of cities. And lastly, the skill set has to be different. Rather than being able to negotiate or advocate or represent, you have to have great managerial skills, great organizational skills. You have to have a sufficient level of digital literacy. And above all, you have to understand, live and breathe marketing. That's the essence of new diplomacy. A few tips of things that I learned in my career. Many people think that it's all about designing a new face, a new visual language. No, it's not about logo. It's about substance. Many business leaders, many political leaders know what they want to say. They're less interested in what you want to hear. The way you find what you want to hear is simply by investing in independent research. Research is critically important in new diplomacy. The focus has to be on quality and not necessarily on quantity. So if in the old days it was all about ratings, today it's all about the quality of the emotional connection between the audience and the product, the service, the idea that we're trying to connect them. We have in new diplomacy to embrace narrowcasting and micro-targeting as a way of communicating. We have many, many people in the room that actually are engaged in that type of work. And of course, remember, new diplomacy in the new age of information cannot be self-congratulatory. You cannot say, you know, this is if you recognize the image, the famous Joey Suzu. And Joey Suzu was so funny because he was so self-congratulatory, right? And today just doesn't work. What works today is what we call third-party endorsements. What works today is not you to brag about your own economy, your own achievements, but someone else doing it for you. This is why social networks are so important. Winning diplomacy is one, not seeking a victory. Because diplomacy is not about winning or losing. Diplomacy, again, is about building long-term strategic alliances. The goal is not to win a debate, but to build relevant relationships with people. Constantly strive to form coalitions, partnerships. This is the key, right? One of the things that we're doing with the Genius 100 initiative is bring together people that represent all sorts of things in order to create a critical mass to make things happen. So for example, there was an idea of someone, a brilliant idea, to send all the information that this civilization, our civilization, ever created, to create a civilizational backup, to create a disk that will survive billions of years and send it up to the moon. I know it sounds crazy. He calls it the Lunar Library. We call it the Civilizational Backup Plan. And when he presented the idea at the G100 summit that Julie organized in Mexico a few months ago, a lot of people didn't understand what he was talking about, but Tsili Charney did, and she made it possible for him. And today, although the spacecraft unfortunately crashed, but all the information our civilization ever created is on the moon right now on a disk the size of a nickel, made out of quartz, and it's going to be there for until the next form of intelligent life will discover it and will know what we did here. Another thing that is critically important, many people engaging in diplomacy are not taking the time or the energy or the resources to adequately identify their own competitive edge. And I can tell you as a former Israeli diplomat, this was exactly the case with my government, that insisted on communicating the conflict rather than communicating its assets. And as a result, underperformed in tourism and investment and culture and became vulnerable to all sorts of attempts to boycott and isolate Israel. So effective communications is not just identifying the competitive edge, but the ability to effectively communicate that. Embrace creativity. I cannot overemphasize the importance of creativity. By definition, traditional diplomacy is about conforming. It's not thinking out of the box, it's actually squeezing you into the box. That's what big, large organizations do. Edward de Bono, the big guru of creativity studies, always said, famously said, that creativity is not a gift. It's something that you can learn how to do. There are methodologies, how to think creatively, how to enhance creativity. Creativity is like a muscle. It has to be practiced all the time. And in government and in foreign policy, and also in business diplomacy and corporate diplomacy, there's not enough emphasis put on the need to think creatively and to let people to think creatively. My students are here in the room and they're familiar with the concept of the R-Swim. Let me just very quickly share this with you. This is a roadmap to try to avoid failure. R-Swim is a methodology that stands for 5 steps. 1 is called research. 2nd, strategy, work plan, implementation, and measurement. These are 5 necessary steps when you want to execute a plan, no matter what it is that you're planning. If you're planning to start a new technology company or build a new organization or create a new bank, like in the case of Scott, or open a restaurant, you have to do your research. Out of the research, you have to decide what is the strategy. The strategy is what is going to be the organizing, overarching principle of your new enterprise. So in the case of places, for example, in the case of New York, the strategy, of course, is the big variety, the big temptation. In the case of Tel Aviv, it's nonstop. In the case of Las Vegas, it's sin. And I can give you many, many examples. In the case of Spain, it's the story of everything under the sun, a story of variety and warmth. And of course, then you have to translate the strategy into an actionable, affordable work plan, then implement it, and then measure your effectiveness. These are the 5 steps that can not guarantee, but at least limit the chances of failure if you follow those 5. I can tell you as an Israeli that one of the biggest challenges that we have culturally, this is why most of the startups fail, is because we have a tendency to go straight to the implementation. We start from I. We have an idea. We say, wow, I have this great idea. I know how to do it. Let's do it. You raise money. You pick up the phone. You call your parents. Can you loan me $50,000? I have this idea. It's going to change the world. And then you raise more and more money. And I have to tell you that 80% of the startups fail. And they raise a lot of money. And this money could have been used, really better used and utilized to advance mankind. And the reason people don't follow the R-Swim is the main reason why all this money is being wasted. Because if you do your proper research, and I can tell you most of the startups that fail because of a very simple reason. They were created to solve a problem that doesn't really exist. They were created to solve a problem that doesn't really exist. Now, what are the implications of everything that I'm saying for countries and governments and diplomacy? The implications are profound. It means that content is more important than platform, that quality overrides quantity. People are interested in dialogues, not in monologues. Being attractive is more important than being right. Narrative works better than a legal argument. Creativity is more important than anything. And of course, predictive segmentation is the name of the game.